Tanya, thanks so much for hopping on the Next Level Minds podcast.
I'm stoked to be here. Thank
Y-
you.
Yeah, absolutely. How's the my gosh, what is it? Wednesday this week? So how's Wednesday treating you so far?
Right?
Um, no, that's awesome. It's like, I don't know about you, but I feel like May is just hauling ass from how fast it's going right now, right?
Yeah, it's sad in some ways because it goes so quickly.
Yeah.
And then you're just like, whoa, it's winter. And you're like, how'd that happen? I feel like summer doesn't slow down. It just even goes faster, the days.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's like there's I don't know, there's so much more to do. And I feel like because there's so much more to do, you got travel, you got things after, your work and do your business. And then it's like you're packing your calendar with so much stuff. I feel like that just makes it go by so much quicker.
Yeah, I
And then
agree.
especially from a goal standpoint too, which I know we'll talk about, but like I'll look over my year goals and be like, all right, I have 9 months, I've 8 months. I'm like, oh, I have 6, 7 months now, right? And it like slowly starts to sneak up on you and stuff too, which is kind of crazy. But I want to dive into, a little bit more about your background. I think a good place to start would be, right around 25 years old when you started your first business. And I know obviously like starting any business at any age is a risk and there's a lot of hard work, determination, all that stuff that comes with it. So I would love for you just to talk about kind of how you navigated that and kind of the mindset behind that as well.
So I knew I always wanted to start a business,
Mm,
but I was a little terrified. And then I asked my mother, and I was like, she immigrated from Colombia, and you would assume that she would be like, hey, don't like go the safe route, stay at a corporation, right? But she was the first one who was like, go for it. And I'm like, well, what
mm,
happens if I fail? And she's like, you'll be exactly where you are now, working for somebody. And I was like, oh, I was like, well, what happens if nobody wants to hire me because I failed? And she goes, you wouldn't want to work in a culture like that. And I was like, oh, I have nothing to freaking lose. She's
yeah.
right. I try it, I fail, I go back into working for somebody. And at that moment, and let me remind you, I had no freaking savings.
Mm,
I had no rich uncle to save me. Nobody to save me. This was going to be like all on the line, go for it.
mm.
And so the first year, a lot of work, a lot of determination, grew to over 1 million within the first year and eventually sold it. But I want to say that I had experience working in that industry.
Mm.
And I think that when I say that I've made 1 million, people assume, oh, I made it out of like that. I think it's really hard if you're coming from scratch and no experience.
Mm.
So I just want to caveat that saying I was working in that industry and I was like, wow, I ran almost every position. I know how to go about it. And I was working for others and I was like, damn, I'm just going to do my own thing. And I did it.
Yeah. Yeah, I was gonna say like it was an ad agency, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So did you have ad agency experience before you jumped into that? It sounds like the answer is yes, right?
Yes.
Okay. And what would your advice be if like somebody's in more of like a corporate job? Let's say they're, an engineering role, but then they're like, man, I have such a passion for like health and fitness and all that stuff. And they're like, I want to start like a fitness company. Like, is the answer kind of try to learn as much as you can from somebody else? Or like how can you make that pivot? Because I talk to a lot of people who are like, I want to start this business. I work for a construction company, but I don't want to start a construction company. Like so how can you navigate that shift?
So that's a great question. What I would say, anybody who wants to start a new endeavor in a new industry, go for it.
Mm,
Go start asking people and then just do it on the side. Figure out how to optimize your current role at your company. And then a lot, like let's say, try to, instead of finishing your work at 5, try to finish it at 4 and get that extra hour and work on it. And then go and start pitching your services to people and do it as like almost like an internship. Say,
mm,
hey, I'm going to do this for free. All I would like is for you as a case study or you write a testimonial if I do good work. It does two things. One, it helps you get credibility from established companies. And then the second thing it does, it allows you to see if you freaking like it.
yeah.
What happens if you like don't even like it? Right. And so that's one of the big things I learned in college. Is like in college, I was just talking to somebody about that. Their kids were in college and they were going to wait there until their kid was in the junior to start doing internships. I was like, no, start now. Your
Yeah.
first year, start getting internships. This is the best time to freaking figure out, do I like this? Do I want this industry? What do I like?
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree because it's like experience gives you the most amount of lessons, right? Versus like reading about it. Sure, that's an important aspect. You see all the books behind me, right? But like actually getting your feet wet, getting that experience, I feel like that actually teaches you like what it's like to have the experience to do that, you know?
Yep.
Yeah, so you're saying if they're in that role, just, try some stuff for free or do that internship model like you were kind of referencing, try to get those testimonials, get the feet wet a little bit before like I'm quitting everything, jumping all into this when you might not even like it once you start slowly building it, right?
Or if you're gonna quit something, you should already have some sort of experience in it
Yeah.
or have a really good savings so you can experiment.
Mm.
So I had a friend who is a lawyer, at a company, she was there for like 12 years, but she didn't want to do legal. She was in the
Mm.
financial side and she wanted to go and learn about health. And she's like fascinated with it. And I was like, okay, well, go to these health companies and say, I'm going to do some of your legal work and in health and get yourself in there and understanding what the problems are, what are the challenges, and then go from there. And she was like, oh, and it worked out for her.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. So you had that company, you scaled from 0 to 1 million. You had the preface of like, hey, I knew about the industry before, right? And so that obviously helped. Um, what did you do to get to that million? Like, what were some of like the habits, the routines, the behaviors, maybe some things that you could share with others who may be trying to accomplish that same goal, of course.
So there are a couple of things I did that in hindsight were like pretty smart, but I was just naive.
Yeah, that's funny.
And one of them is like I wanted to travel.
Mm.
Um, Before starting my company, I probably only went to Colombia, and that's the extent of my international traveling. So I was like, I want to travel.
Yeah,
So what I did is I booked during June and around Christmas, somewhere around Christmas to New Year's. I did somewhere in Asia or somewhere far. And then I did a developing country. And then in June, I would kind of do like hike Machu Picchu, or go to Cuba or something along those lines.
yeah.
So what that did, it gave me a goal. I just, I didn't even know. I would just book the flight and then I would figure out everything else. But it
Mm.
made me a goal of like, this is a revenue. And then how can my company run without me? So it forced
Mm.
me to create systems. It forced me to hire people. It forced me to do a number of things that I just wanted to travel. Little did I know this was helping me like figure out how to delegate, have a system and process in hand. So that's why I said in hindsight, it was amazing, but I didn't know that. I just wanted
Yeah.
to travel.
I, I love that. I think that's so cool because like I see, and you probably see this all the time with a lot of your clients, but like people just haven't removed themselves from the equation, and then the business is like ultimately running them, and they're
Yeah.
working like way more than they would be at like an 8 to 5. Honestly, might even be making less, and it's like this is not what I signed up for, right? And then so how did you go about? You said you did it unintentionally, but the biggest thing I hear from entrepreneurs who are in that early phase of like why they haven't created the system is just because they're like, oh, I'm so busy keeping the day to day alive and just staying afloat. They're like, I can't even think about SOPs and delegate. So like, kind of, what's your advice there? Because I'm sure you have some people that say that to you.
Oh, right now, SOPs. I wish I was 25 creating SOPs back then.
Yeah.
SOPs are so much easier now. Here's a framework. Literally get Loom, record yourself doing it,
Yep.
and then have AI have like a prompt to put in ChatGPT, and there's your SOP with video.
Mm,
Done.
yeah.
There's a little bit more of a format. If somebody wants it, they can DM me, but that is the fastest way where I had to like literally like screenshot, put it together. But to me, I was like, I figured out when I hired my first person, I was putting so much energy into them. And then if they left, I felt like I was like, oh my God, that was so much time. So I needed to figure out a way where no matter who I hired, I had a system in place.
Yeah, yeah. I love that. I heard something one time you basically kind of said it in a different way, but I thought this way was pretty cool too. I had the founder of Dirty Dough, so it's Crumble Cookies competitor on the podcast, and he was basically saying like when he started his company, you're obviously doing like marketing, accounting, graphic design, everything. And he was like, I was basically just trying to replace that job title like as quick as possible with the right person to remove myself from that equation, which I thought was a really cool concept.
I think it's perfect. I think in the beginning, most people, like most companies, it's hard for them to get to 100,000.
Yeah, yeah,
Then after that, it's a 250,000. And then
yeah.
from 250, it's 500. And so everyone is like new levels, new devils. But the
Mm,
problem with the 100,000, and once you get there, is they end up doing everything and they don't realize that you can get somebody for $4 to $6 an hour on Upwork.
yeah.
And but they're like, oh no, what about the quality? Or what about this? Like, look at all the things you do and like think about, okay, if only I have to get in a conversation with my clients, then what other research can I outsource? You
Mm,
know, what can all this little things so then I'm really just spending an hour of my time.
yeah. Versus you're spending, 6 hours doing those kind of
The research,
trivial
the
things.
emails
Yeah.
after everything.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
for
Yeah. Yeah.
example, think about podcasting, right? One of the things that people do is like a lot of marketers will be like, oh, just get on podcasts. You
Mm,
can do it. Yeah. Do you know how much research and the right way to go about it? It's a, you have to first get the emails, research the podcast, see the research, send the emails, follow up. But there's so much that entails to get on somebody else's podcast,
yeah. Yeah. I mean,
right?
I get like probably 15 messages a week. Obviously, yours stuck out. So kudos because you did a great
Yeah.
job at
Thanks.
like explaining why you wanted to be on it and like the value you could add to the show. But like, I agree. It's like you had to research me, you had to find my email. I mean, it takes a lot of time. It's not as easy as just snapping your finger.
But people assume that.
It
So I think that breaking up all these little processes and getting it somebody else to work on it and then you doing your magic touch
is.
is optimal.
Yeah, I love it. Um, so let's shift a little bit. So you sold this company. What was that process like a bit cut and dry, or did you search for the buyer? Did you have a business broker? Always just kind of curious how people exit their
So that
company
one
too.
I did a couple of mistakes on that one.
Okay.
So I my company was running so well that I actually got involved in other companies. I was
Mm,
investing in other companies, and then one we raised money, and I was a CMO, and they wanted me to be the CEO, and they wanted me to raise money next round, which like was going to be 1 million plus. And here I was raising it, I was getting everything done, and we had an investor, and then they said, you got to sell your company. I'm like, what?
yeah.
And I was like, it's cash cow. Like, it's
You're like it's
perfect.
running itself. Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
And they're like, no, we don't want any distractions. And so, like, I had to do a quick sell, find a buyer. It was like, and companies like that, when you're in an agency, they want you to stay on and have an earnout.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So it was a whole complicated thing. And the best part of it, I decided after like I sold, I got found a partner that I actually didn't want to continue at the startup.
After you sold the company.
Yep. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
And it was like, it was a big breakthrough for me, but it was one that I had to kind of like, because I all the companies I've ever done have been bootstrapped. I never raised
Mm,
money. And that was going to be the first time. And I felt like when you raise money, there's a lot on the line, right? You're
yeah.
no longer in control. I can't take my vacations, you know? I can't do all of these things that I like. I knew that if I took somebody's money, I would give it all I got. And there would
Yeah.
be a cost to it.
Yeah, and you're constantly having to give updates to people. You have like, the weight on your shoulders because you're like, I have other people's money that I'm doing this project for. Essentially, like, I don't want to lose it. So, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, did you pivot?
But
What
it's
was the
super
pivot?
appealing, by the way, because like the lure of like doing a startup and
Yeah,
like growing it, it's very ego driven when I look back at it because I was like, oh wow, this is cool. Can I actually do it? And then I
yeah,
had to like really get like, is this what I really want? Are these my values? Or is it like outside values of being perceived as something?
as like a startup, founder, early startup individual who's like done the investing rounds, all that
Yeah.
stuff. Yeah, 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 yeah. So what was the pivot from there? So you had the agency, you sold it quickly, you CMO, and then they're like, actually, we don't want you to be CEO and raise some more money. And then you're like, probably not the best avenue for me. So what was your next kind of avenue that you went down from there?
So I had another company still running. So that was good. It was like more of like this search arbitrage company.
Hmm.
So that was kind
Cool.
of fun. It wasn't gonna um it wasn't what I wanted to do, but I kind of had it sustained. It was like a revenue that I didn't have to go about it. So I was like, what the F do I want to do?
Yeah.
I traveled, and then an opportunity came, and I was working at this company called Leela, and I was going in as I forgot what my position is, but I was basically in charge of all their marketing. And it was like I was like, let me see how it is working at a startup because I've worked at smaller startups, but not one with that's funded. And they had like it's a CEO of Coca-Cola, the former CMO of Yahoo. I was like, oh wow, I'm gonna learn so much about these people. But what was fascinating was I met many cool colleagues, but the way it was run as a big company, but it was a startup. So we
Mm.
weren't as agile. So I learned a lot of cool things about that. I lasted a year or something.
Yeah.
And then I was like, yeah, that's not for me.
Yeah.
And then I started, I was like, I was always passionate about helping entrepreneurs. So then that's when I started Owners Up. And Owners Up came from me solving an itch I had early on where I didn't have any peers to bounce ideas off of. I've been a
Mm.
collegiate athlete, I'm an endurance runner. And even if I was going to do the Boston Marathon or anything, I would sign up with a team.
Yeah.
Because, like, when you go for something that big, you need other people who are on the same path as you so you can bounce ideas, kind of share stories with. You have a coach who course corrects you, and someone who's going to be like, I've been through this injury. You better watch out. Like, don't do this. And so I was like, what the heck? Why don't entrepreneurs have us?
Mm.
And sure, there's accelerators, but if you're raising money or if there's like companies like maybe like EO, but you have to be making 250,000 plus. But what about those people who are just starting? Where do they go?
Yeah. And they need the support at that
Yeah,
level for
they're the
sure.
ones who need the support the most.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that was kind of where the idea of Owners Up came about.
Yeah. So
And
I kind of say like it's like a CrossFit for small businesses.
okay. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
So it's targeted for B2B service-based entrepreneurs.
Cool.
And what I really want is people who want to have a business, but also have a life.
Mm.
It's very different, right? So the accelerator people are like, hey, I'm going to give up everything to
Hmm.
build this business. So one day I have a payout, right? Or one day
Mm.
this happens. But what happens if you can design your life that like you're having fun, you're making an impact, you're making money, and you actually have family and friends and hobbies?
Yeah. Yeah. I love the like y'all's mission. And forgive me if I butcher this because I looked at it like 2 days ago, but is it like crush it at work, but then also win at home is
Yeah.
kind of like
It's like
your
something
vision.
along that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's ideally what it is. It's more about how can you have it all?
Yeah. And I think that's super cool because you have like such a niche. Like you talked about the accelerator where it's like I'm gonna give up everything for 5-10 years, hopefully sell and have this big payout. But it's like, what about like you said, the people that just want to have this B2B service business, but then also enjoy life while making some decent money along the way. So for these people that are joining, is it more of kind of like a monthly membership that they're going in, or
Yeah,
how
it's a
does that
monthly
work?
membership and then it's
Okay.
a weekly call. So
Okay.
what ends up happening is you get to learn something, you get a playbook on how to delegate it. Because sometimes, for example, let's use that example of the podcasting. You've been told to podcast. Now you're like, I don't know if I have time to do this. Like,
Yeah.
so how do you hand off the process to somebody and have all of it get done?
Mm.
Right. And so now you have the playbook and then you know the knowledge on how to go about it. But if there's any challenges, you also break out into weekly groups where you get to actually brainstorm with peers. Because I have coached some of the people that have been amazing marketers, amazing salespeople, but guess what their biggest challenge is?
They don't outsource or delegate or
Oh, well, that's one of them,
yeah.
doing it for themselves.
Mm, yeah.
So the best salespeople sometimes aren't really good at selling their own services.
Yeah. But
The
they're good at
marketers, same thing. They're just too damn close to it. So
yeah.
you kind of that peer feedback is awesome. It's kind of like sometimes people question what's their unique ability or their genius. And like you might think it's something else, but the whole world sees it as something differently.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. Are you these weekly calls, so are you like coaching on them or is it just peer led where they're kind of talking throughout a variety of different topics?
So it's First, where I'm kind of coaching on something that's a problem, like the challenge that they have.
Yep.
And then we break it out. So like it's kind of like coach, hot seat, and then break out
Mm.
into groups. And I think that's super important, the peer feedback.
And you're making the playbook that you referenced as well, or
Yeah.
okay, cool. And
Well,
that
someone on
probably
my team is creating. We're
right.
both combined creating it. Yes.
Yeah, and that probably comes from like your experience of running different companies, being involved in startups, and I'm sure that's helpful for them to have because then it's kind of like a step-by-step thing that they can utilize on how to do a particular initiative, right?
It's also my experience because there's so many new things. So like I'll
Yeah.
go to a conference or like I'll maybe buy some like program and I get really excited and I learn about it and I'm like, oh yeah, I can't wait to do it. Then I find the time to freaking do it. And guess what? I get stuck. I
Yeah.
get in my head and I'm like, let's say it's like an email you have to send down. I'm like, oh, is this the right email? Or for you, like you're in sales, like how do I do the whole sales, like the messaging,
Hmm.
all of that? And you get so in your head. And if you just had that pure feedback or you knew exactly like a template, you would be moving so much faster. So I
Yeah.
think that's what happens. And what ends up happening in the program is, or like you come from a conference, you get stuck, and then you're just like, maybe this isn't for me. Or you do it once and then you're like, oh, I don't want to do this every day. So then how can you do it consistently?
Yep.
And
Yep.
so the best way to do it consistently is to kind of delegate it.
Hmm. And then, like you said, you're kind of taking yourself out of that, being able to get more done with less because you've delegated it. What was your first couple like clients like? Did you have to cold message them? Were they referrals? Because going from 0 to 1 is sometimes like the hardest thing to do. So I'm kind of curious how you went about that.
So for owners up, and I tell this to a lot of people, I said, well, first I try to think like a scientist
Hmm.
because then it gets emotion out. So I have a hypothesis. I think that small groups and meeting regularly, weekly, is going to help people accelerate their business. That's how we just started.
Yeah.
And so now my hypothesis was like, that's it. So now I'm like, will it work with startups? Will it work with small businesses or will it work with companies over 1 million?
Hmm.
So I went out and I reached in my network and I found 5 companies for each.
Hmm.
And then I said, hey, if you're going to hire me as a marketer, it would cost you about, I don't know, 300 at that time, 300 plus an hour. Why don't you try this out? And in 3 months, you're signing up for 3 months to test it out. If not, you have me as marketing in a cheaper value.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
everyone was like, awesome, let's do this,
Yeah.
right? So then everybody
Cool.
signed up. And then I realized that the startup people, I didn't want to coach because they're in scarcity mode. So they had a whole nother
Hmm.
different kind of mindset. And the 1 million plus, they were so busy that they could barely do the weekly calls.
Yeah. Yeah. And they weren't getting like the value out of it, right?
So it would change the structure. So then I went with that sweet spot, which is around 100,000 to 1 million is my sweet spot. And then I move companies 1 million, but then we move them to another structure for when I do that.
Okay, that makes sense. And that came from just testing that hypothesis, it sounds like,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Isn't it? It's so much easier when you think like as a hypothesis. You're like, there's no attachment to it. It's just data. You're just going to test it out.
Yeah, I like what you said of like thinking like a scientist. I'm gonna remember that and think all the entrepreneurs that are listening or people that are trying to start their thing, like encouraging them to do that as well. And like you said, you're not attached to it. You just have the data to look at. You're like, well, this one doesn't work, but this group worked really well. So I really like that you went about that. How did you, and maybe you use this whole scientific approach too, how did you go about pricing your service? Because I think that holds a lot of people back as well. And don't no need to like dive into like how much it costs monthly, all that. Like feel free to just keep that to yourself. I'm just kind of curious of like, did you survey people? Did you look up organizations on where to find the pricing?
I just thought, what would be a fair price? You need to have something that if you price it too cheap, then, well, in the beginning, you're going to do it as a no-brainer
Yeah.
because you want to see how people are going to react to it. What's their
Yeah.
behavior? Do they like the content? I had one member. She ran a successful interior design company, and now
Hmm.
she ran it that she no longer had to be the face of the company or go to the meetings. Now she wanted to train other interior designers how to go about this.
Hmm.
Mostly people, architects or things that like the owner's the sole business, the face of the company, right? And she wanted to kind of change that. So she built out this whole, she's like, oh, I have to build out the framework. And I was like, why don't you just like first get your clients and then build down, go from there. And she's like, oh, I need a little more structure. What she realized is her one, her one topic, they wanted to have it for 4 months, when
Hmm.
she thought it was going to just be one session. And because people sometimes, when you overload them with too much information, they don't get anything done. You have to do
Yeah.
small bites. And
It's like,
so it's like, as an entrepreneur, you're just kind of like, you want to give value, but you want to give them enough value that they take action. And you
uh,
won't know that.
until you start, right? Yeah. And it sounded like information overload could happen if you went about it the
Oh, it
wrong way,
happens
right?
all the time. In the beginning, I did information overload too. It's easy
Yeah.
because you just assume that people understand all of this or they have the basics.
Yep. What is your, speaking of information, like what's your take on this? I mean, there's like podcasts, there's YouTube videos, there's peer groups on everything under the sun that you can learn. If you want to learn podcasting, it's there. If you want to learn interior design, it's there. But I feel like a lot of people get caught up with like doing everything knowledge wise without like the execution of it, right? So how do you kind of like go about that? Of all right, is it read a book on this business, then try something, and then go back and listen to a podcast? Like I see so many people that they can quote any entrepreneur book, but they don't have like a single product or service that they've been selling, you know?
It's the same analogy as like losing weight. It's like, oh, let me buy this program, let me buy this, let me buy this book. And then they never lose weight because
Mm,
it makes you feel good that you're doing something about it, but you're really not taking action.
yeah. And action is ultimately the only thing that's going
I
to
think
drive
somebody,
results.
a friend or mentor said something to me about this, and this is very crude, but it's like reading a book about sex.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You
I think
gotta
you just got
actually
to do
do
it,
it.
right?
You
To
just
figure
got to
it
do it.
out, then like read it and watch it. It's totally different. So yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's awesome.
very crude, but that's how it like lands. Because then people are like, "Well, I read diet books and like I get the knowledge, I know what to do," and it's like, and then you tell them this, and then there's no excuse on that one. Like, how do you?
Yeah. I love the crude ones too, because like you're gonna remember that, right? It's like,
Yeah.
oh, that made me laugh, and that one kind of stuck out a little bit. Um, when you are talking with people in this program, like I'm just kind of curious, what are some successful traits that you see in some of the top business owners that you've worked with?
Resilience,
Mm, I like that.
getting up and doing it again.
Yeah.
That's it. Really, it's just consistency is like the big one, and being resilient.
Mm.
So it's grit. So passion, perseverance to do it. And I didn't answer your other question about like, okay, well, how do you make a difference between the book? This is how
Oh
I would
yeah,
go about anything I do. Um, if I, let's say I wanted to start doing YouTube, I would find other people who also wanted to do it.
yeah.
I would set up a whole structure and say, hey, we're going to learn and do at the same time.
Mm. And then kind of have accountability under
Yeah,
it
you
too,
have
right? Yeah.
accountability and you have information because, like, you and I can read the same book, but maybe you picked up something differently than I did. And
Yeah.
then now we're sharing it and then we're implementing it.
Mm. And
And then
you
as we're doing, we're also sharing what we've learned. And then now we're just like exponentially learning. That's the cool thing about peer groups. You're exponentially learning and you're doing it at the same time.
and you guys probably all have a common goal or a common goal, but then individual goals. And so they probably know yours, you probably know them. You can kind of talk through like the action steps to help drive towards that goal too.
Yeah, so like let's say it's like we all want to do YouTube and the goal is you have to post once a week.
Yeah.
So first it's like get used to posting. Then after that, it's kind of like, okay, well, how many views? What's the end goal? Do we want them to buy something? Do we want newsletters?
Mm.
Do like what it is, and then go from there. But I think that if you need to do baby steps, and I think some people try to go very quickly, too quick, right? Unless you know what you're doing, don't go quickly. Like because you're going to get overwhelmed or you're going to be like, oh, this is like, it's like signing up for a marathon and going and running like a half marathon when you've never done it.
Yeah.
You're
And
going to
you've
get
done,
injured. You're going to get hurt. You're going to learn
yeah.
a lot, but it's going to be like, not the ideal scenario.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. I've always done like primarily weightlifting, and then this year I'm like trying to run more just because I think it's cool, honestly, and the importance of it. And the other day I was like, all right, I'm gonna sign up for like a half marathon. I was like, well, I've only done 10Ks, and I was like, I'm just gonna try 10 miles, and like I did it, but I was like, man, I'm glad I started there instead of like just on a whim signing up for a half marathon and getting like my ass handed to me, you
Yeah.
know? But yeah, I mean, like you can relate working out to so many different things, like the diet thing, like starting a business. It's like you can read all the books about starting a business, but you actually have to go, like in the diet case, follow the diet, go work out and things like that. So, I
And by the
love
way,
kind
bringing
of the
up that
synergy.
weightlifting thing, this is very, very key, especially with social media and everything, that we are in like this comparison mode. Like we're
Mm,
comparing somebody's like 100th chapter to like our first chapter.
mm,
And so what ends up happening is like when we work out, let's say I wanted to run a mile and all of a sudden I start running and I'm like, oh, well, I guess I'm not that fast, or I guess I'm not like this. So you're comparing someone else's instead of saying, wow, I am now like running a mile consistently at like 6 miles, 6 minute miles, right?
yeah.
Instead of being like, oh, I'm not that fast or blah, blah, blah. You always go from your starting. And I think that's where you get it
Mm,
from lifting weights, right? You're not comparing yourself to others. You're like, wow, shoot, I went from benching this to benching this instead of being like, how much more do I have? And I think as entrepreneurs and just everything, we're just always looking at like, how much more? And that is a sign of burnout.
mm,
And with entrepreneurs, even the ones I like, as overachievers, you're always kind of like achieving something and looking for the next one, looking for the next one,
mm.
never stopping and acknowledging, shoot, look how much I've accomplished. And I think
Yeah,
it's super important.
yeah, I love that. And man, I love that you just called out like the burnout piece, because that can happen. It sounds like if you're not stopping and acknowledging like the wins, is that kind of, am I
Yeah,
understanding that correctly?
absolutely. Like I have a framework where it takes me 3 minutes and it's essential. And it's called
Hmm.
RAP, RAP. So R is actually you write down everything you did that day. So you're reviewing. And sometimes you're just like, there's days where you're just like, oh my God, I'm exhausted, or like, what the heck did I do? So when you write it down, you're like, wow, I could have probably delegated that, or oh, I
Mm.
need to spend more time on this. So you're taking the time to be more aware. Kind of like if you're working out, like if you're working out, you're lifting weights, you're like, maybe I shouldn't have eaten that before I worked out. You're starting to become aware of things so you can start changing. A is for assess. So you rate your day 1 to 5. The cool thing about that is the days that are like awesome that you're rating a 5, you can reverse engineer it and figure out why were these days 5s and how can you have all your days be 5s,
Yeah.
right? It's just data. It's kind of like working out. Oh shoot, all my best workouts are when I like drink this mix, you know what I mean, whatever, and I
Yeah.
work out at this time. Then you're just like now you're having awesome workouts all the time.
Mm.
And then P is prioritize. What are the 3 things you want to get done the next day?
Mm.
And then you want to put a time constraint on that, because I think that people always say, like, oh, what are the 3 things? But like time constraint, because then you get realistic on what you get accomplished. So bringing it back to workout, since we have this whole
Yeah.
working out theme going on, is like, shoot, you only have 1 hour workout. Now you're going to figure out what kind of like, do you want to do your arms? How many,
Mm.
what can you do to fit in that hour, instead of being like, oh, I have the whole day. What should I going to do for working out? You know, it's a huge difference. So constraints are your best friends because it gets you realistically on what you should prioritize. So it leads you to your goal.
Yeah, I like that, rather than like, oh, I have the whole day, or anything like that. And like the whole Parkinson's law, that like the task expands to the time that you give it. You're like, oh, I'm gonna do this errand by Friday. Well, it's gonna take you till Friday. But if you're like, I'm gonna do this by, Thursday morning, you'll get it done by Thursday morning. So I like that approach a lot. So just to review that, wrap, review what you did that day, right? And
Yep.
then assess is A, and then P is prioritize. Three things, right?
Yep.
Okay.
It's like wrap. You're wrapping up the day, but without the W. So you can bet.
Yeah, 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 the hip hop version of rap,
Yeah, the
right?
hip hop
Yeah,
version.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's cool. I want to talk about a LinkedIn post that you posted that I thought was pretty cool, and it kind of encompasses a lot of these themes that we talked about. So I don't remember all my LinkedIn posts. Don't expect you to as well. But you basically said something along the lines of like, I chat with founders who are pulling in, 5 to 40K a month. They share some things in common. You talked about like imposter syndrome, endless tasks. Their income goes up like a yo-yo, second guessing their decisions, juggling multiple roles. Um, and is the way out of that, stressful kind of reactive state more on like, let's delegate things, let's assess what we're doing. Like, I'm just kind of curious, for those founders that you talked about, is that what you're telling them to do, is start doing the rap, start delegating things like that?
First, you got to get aware.
Mm.
You're in such a like a mode of like overwhelm that your body and your brain is getting used to the chaos.
Yeah.
And then you're thinking everything on your to-do list needs to get done.
Yeah.
So first you got to figure out what are your values.
Mm.
And I think it sounds so woo-woo. What are your values? But actually it's not. I used to think it was woo-woo. I was like, what do you mean my values?
Trying to make
Integrity. And
money
I would
over
just
here.
like
Yeah.
make up some words, right? But you start realizing what are your values. You start seeing like when you make decisions, is this like so for example, when I was in performance-based marketing, my values was I really wanted to help people and impact people. So me selling some marketing a loan or something that's like gonna um monopolize on poor people does not work for me no matter how much money I'm making,
Right.
right? And so that stops me in certain things, or my value of like, oh, I want to spend time with my family or travel. So
Mm.
that's what I'm saying, like values that help you align with your goals and your time. Now,
Yeah.
after that, it's awareness of like, what are these habits that you're automatically default doing, right?
Mm.
What is it that like nowadays, like when you're bored, you pick up your phone, you're on social media, you're avoiding something, you're avoiding your task, you're avoiding your life, whatever it is. We're getting so used to this dopamine hits. So now we have to get aware of like what's taking our attention
Yeah.
and why are we doing these tasks. So now that you've gotten aware, now the next thing is usually like, okay, well, what is it that you can do to get more of your time back? One,
Mm.
it's like really kind of seeing all your time on the calendar. And then the second one is like delegating. And delegating is a hard one because everyone feels like nobody else can do it as good as they can, or they think that they can't afford somebody who can do it.
Mm. But you just touched on at the beginning, like what, 40 minutes ago, that it's like $6 to $7 at some things on
Yeah.
Upwork, right?
And it's just, there's, of course, like if it's more specialized, but there's a
Right.
lot of tasks you can get off your plate that are just small. Like
Yep.
you shouldn't be spending time booking anything. You should have a lot of things that are automated in your systems,
Yeah.
right?
Do you use any like AI tools or suggest any of that?
Oh, yeah. I love AI.
Nice. Just curious if you had any like top of mind suggestions out there for any of the listeners.
So for LinkedIn, is it AI? I guess so. I like this program called Authored Up.
Mm.
I like it just because the user interface is really nice. It doesn't create content, but it does help you with like thinking about formatting hooks and then
That's
structuring
cool.
things. Um, there's so many AI tools I use that
Yeah.
it's like secondhand. That's almost like saying like, what do you use as your calendar, your email? I'm like, wait, Google, doesn't everyone do? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But
Yeah, it's funny.
like
Do,
even I guess every conversation I record.
nice.
So I use Fathom for that.
Okay.
Um yeah, there's a bunch. I can't now
And
you
that
put me
helps
on
you
a
with
spot.
what, like note taking essentially, or
Yeah, so what it
okay.
does, it's really cool. It like summarizes, it gets all the questions and then actions, the next
Oh, that's
steps.
cool. I want to start using that because I'll do a lot of like sales meetings and I literally just have a template that's like notes, next steps, key actions. And I'm like, what if I could just like throw that recording in there and it was like, here you go, rather than me having to be like, wait, can you repeat what you said? All that stuff.
Oh, Fathom is great for that.
Yeah,
And then
that's
it can
awesome.
also tell you like you're talking too much or you didn't like right ask the right questions.
Yeah. That's funny. It's like a coach right there with you being like,
Yeah.
hey, shut up for a second, let them talk, right?
Hmm.
No, that's super cool. The last thing I want to ask you is, we use like the workout theme. We're kind of bringing that back. So, you said you did like half Ironmans, marathons, but then I think when you reached out to me, you were like, I have brittle bones, right? So, like, how'd you do that? Because I feel like that isn't easy to go about doing those daunting
Yeah, so
endurance
I
runs.
have a rare disease called osteogenesis imperfecta, which is brittle bones.
Hmm.
Um, the spectrum of it, I'm like in one of the best positions. So I don't have it as much. I have broken bones, but my bones are like not as fragile as somebody like my oldest sister, who is a wheelchair user since she was young, and she's broken over 200 bones. And she
Wow.
gets a cold, she'll crack a rib, right? And the most extreme is when you have a baby and the baby starts breaking bones in the womb. and pretty
Mm.
much dies in the week after or something, or 2 weeks. It's very unfortunate. So it's very rare. There's actually a lot of like I think the movie's called Unbreakable or something like that. I forgot what the movie, but there's something about that.
Yeah.
And so I found out I had it after I did a half Ironman.
After you
Yeah.
did the half Ironman?
Yeah, I
What the
literally
hell?
had a hairline fracture on my hip and I was walking to work like 1 mile. I lived in New York City. I was walking to my office. I didn't know it. And then my employees are like, dude, I've never seen you pop a pill. I was popping ibuprofen. And they've seen me do marathons. They see me do crazy training. And they're like, you're popping a pill. I'm like, oh, you're right. I am. And then I went to a doctor and that's where they found out everything. So I had no clue.
Yeah.
And then I started training, doing more of that. Then I realized that it helped out. But yeah, it does take a really, it's kind of like this awesome question is like, if I knew earlier, would I have not done the things I've done?
Hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Ignorance is bliss sometimes, right?
It is because it's like you probably love doing those runs and like the community that you've built around it and the
Yeah.
feeling of accomplishment. But it's like, well, if you did know the whole time, like, would you have ever been able to experience those awesome stuff, you know?
And the identity, I think of a lot of entrepreneurs go through this is that they think of themselves as just something, right? Like I'm an entrepreneur and they can't imagine doing anything else but an entrepreneur. And that's great. But if something happens and your identity's all tied into that, it takes a major like hit on your like
Yeah.
ego and everything. So when I couldn't call myself a runner, I was like, oh shoot, what? But then I got to experience now I'm doing a century ride in August.
Hmm.
It's 100 miles on a bike.
Yeah, that's no easy ride either. Um, when it comes to identity, do you suggest then like tying it more into like the values and things like that rather than
Yeah.
I'm an entrepreneur?
It's a hard lesson. I think identity is just your values, who you want. I would do different things because when you get tied up in one identity, it's hard to shift.
Yeah. I like that. Thanks again for being on the show. This was super cool. I think we talked about so much stuff into one episode, like values, talked about working out, the theme there, talked about just delegation, automation. So I think a lot of the listeners are going to walk away with a ton of value. The last thing that I want to ask you is if you were at a crosswalk, let's just go throw back to New York City because that's where you used to live and someone at the crosswalk when it like does the walking symbol, they're like, "Hey, I think I heard you on Chris's podcast. Like, I would just love some quick advice on how to be successful." We'll keep it a little bit generic just because everyone wants to know that. What would you maybe give them as like a you got a quick crosswalk to get in New York and you're walking fast because you're in New York, everyone's hauling there, right?
I think I'm going to use Nike's slogan just do it.
I love it.
The best way to do is just learn. I think a lot of people are thinking about doing things. Just go out there. You have nothing to lose. When you think about you have nothing really to lose, just your time, because you're already thinking about it, you might as well just do it. Spend the time just doing it, getting the stats and the data and pivoting because no one's going to be like holding you to like, oh my goodness, did you try to do your own business and you failed? And everyone's kind of like watching you. No one's watching you, right?
Yeah.
It's just you.
Yeah, it's just you at the end of the day and being able to battle kind of that inner self-talk that comes up all the time, right?
Mm-hmm. And the way to get past that is to start document all your gains, right?
Mm.
Starting from where you're starting, not where somebody else is starting, comparing yourself. Your starting point and the progress you've made. That's the best way.
Yeah,
And then
I
just
love.
thinking of it as like a scientist, you're learning. Everything's just learning. Every time you fail, you're just failing up. You're like, oh, okay, that didn't work. Let me try something else. Kind of like in sales, like you like try to close something that, oh, that rebuttal did not work. Okay, let me change that up.
Yeah, or like this guy hung up on me. I'm gonna not use that one again, right?
Yeah.
That's funny. Well, hey, thanks again for being on the podcast. I love the conversation. I know the listeners will as well. And I'll be sure to connect your social media links in the podcast. But if you want to plug any of them real quick, feel free to.
Awesome. Yeah. So anybody want to reach out to me on LinkedIn? I'm really active on LinkedIn. It's Tanya Alvarez and on Instagram and mention this podcast and have a question. I'm sure I have a playbook on it and I'll send it over.
Perfect. Thanks again, Tanya, for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.